Welcome to part 2 of the Rusty Patch Bumblebee Animal Project. We left off talking about some of the major organ systems within the Rusty Patch Bumblebee, and some of which are pictured here. And I'm going to go closer in depth now to the nervous system. The nervous system on this diagram shows purple. So we see cerebral ganglia, nerve cord, and that's about it. But there's a little more to it. We're going to find out what that is. So when we look at a nervous system, we usually refer to the brain, and the other term for that is the cerebral ganglia in the case of an insect with a tiny simple brain. And then a nerve cord, you would call this your spinal cord. They have a ventral nerve cord, so that means it goes along their belly under their exoskeleton. And then you see these little strings coming off the side. Those are peripheral nerves. So major organs of the nervous system usually focus on the brain. In this case, a ventral nerve cord instead of like ours on the back, which would be a dorsal nerve cord or a spinal cord, and peripheral nerves. So peripheral nerves are nerves that extend out away from the central nervous system, because that's what the brain and spinal cord would be, or in this case, the brain and ventral nerve cord. When we talk about the nervous system, though, we also would typically include some accessories. And those accessories would be receptors like sense organs. So your ears would be a sense organ that would take in information about sounds that you hear. And then, so we have receptors and glial cells, which are cells that specifically support neurons. So what's a neuron? Well, a neuron is a nerve cell. So let's look at a neural circuit. There are 3 different types of nerve cells or neurons that are involved in what's called a neural circuit. So here is one type of neuron, and this would be one that would be tied to a receptor. So a receptor like an ear would be here next to number 1, and then take in sound information through the sensory neuron into the central nervous system. When it gets to the spinal cord and or brain area, that's the central nervous system, and the neurons in there are called interneurons. And these are the ones that do interpretation of the information you're taking in. And then from that interpretation, it gives direction on how to respond. So the response to nervous system signals from the central nervous system are taken care of by the motor neurons. They're sending information out to have your body do something. And so receptors take in information, and effectors are things that do something. So for example, a sense organ on the Rusty Patch Bumblebee would be its antenna. Its antenna would be taking smells and or tastes from the air. So as I said, the antenna is a receptor taking in information about smells in the air that might indicate food, for example. And then it would take information in through the sensory neurons to the interneurons, and then the brain would interpret that as a good smell, and then maybe respond for the Rusty Patch Bumblebee to then engage flight muscles, which would be effectors, to go in search of that food. So flight muscles would be an effector. Skeletal muscles are typically effectors. Other effectors in organisms' bodies are oftentimes glands too. They respond to signals from the central nervous system. Some support cells of neurons. Neurons are the ones that send the signals, but because they're so busy sending signals, they don't have time and energy to do a lot of other things. And so these glial cells are kind of like the servants of the neurons. So there's 4 key roles that are outlined by these special glial cells. So some of the neurons have a cell body that is vulnerable outside of its long axon, and so sometimes they're wrapped in what are called satellite cells and just give a little bit of support and nourishment. Schwann cells wrap along the long skinny part of neurons called the axon and help give it extra support and help transmit the signal a little more efficiently. All right, so interruption 2 taken care of. So glial cells, support cells of neurons. Some important ones are astrocytes, and they help give structural support, but also give nourishment, food nourishment to neurons of the central nervous system, so brain cells. And then these microglial cells are kind of like the white blood cells of the brain. So their job is to make sure that nothing infectious can hurt brain cells. And then these oligodendrocytes also wrap around axons of central nervous system cells and help facilitate or speed up nerve conduction, but also give physical structural support. And then these ependymal cells wrap around the inner lining of the brain cavity and the spinal cavity of our bodies. And they help move cerebral spinal fluid through the body. So these particular cells may not be the same in the rusty patch bumblebee as us, but they would have these other glial cells. If we were to look at one organ within the nervous system and how is it put together to explain tissues coming together to make an organ, this could be one example, and this would be specifically looking at a peripheral nerve. So again, a nerve that comes out from the brain or ventral nerve cord. And a nerve is a whole bunch of neurons. So here's a neuron wrapped in glial cells called Schwann cells. And then there's a connective tissue around each one of those that form these bundles called fascicles. And then another layer of connective tissue around that fascicle. And then another layer of connective tissue surrounding the entire nerve. So there's connective tissue and nervous tissue are the primary tissues within a nerve. But it's also worth noting that there's adipose tissue, which is a type of loose connective tissue that stores fat. And there's also, it's going to give a little cushioning too. And then there's also blood vessels or vascular tissue coming through here. And so blood vessels are a type of, they're going to be made up of, they're going to be lined with epithelial tissue. They're going to be covered in connective tissue, and then the arteries are going to have a layer of muscle tissue within them. And then the blood going through these vessels is a type of connective tissue. So these are different tissues related to this one organ and how it's put together. Neurogenesis in the hippocampus of brains. So does a rusty patch bumblebee have an hippocampus? No. But they do have this process that happens called neurogenesis, which is the growth of new neurons or nervous system cells. And so they're showing you in this diagram that neurogenesis begins from stem cells within the brain, and they might develop into glial cells, support cells like astrocytes, or they might develop into other neurons, a very small percentage. There was a time where they didn't think that neurogenesis happened. They thought once you were born with all the neurons you'd have, and that they didn't go through cell division. But they've done research on the brains of rats, and they realized that they do. And then they've done further research, and they see that neurogenesis does happen in insects. And so that would include the rusty-patched bumblebee. And the hippocampus of our brain is what is related to learning and memory. And so bees learn and remember smells for finding food and where they can locate that food. And so they would grow some cells in their brain to facilitate their memory and learning. And so cell division is what this is all about. So they would go through mitosis and cytokinesis. And then they would specialize or differentiate into whatever kind of cell they're going to be. Are they going to become a glial cell? Or are they going to become a neuron? So this is just an overview of cell division. But what ultimately happens during that process is the nucleus. The chromosomes condense in the nucleus after the DNA has divided. And then the chromosomes have duplicated, and then those chromosome duplicates split apart across into two separate nuclei. And so you're forming two nuclei, and then the cytoplasm pinches off. That's called cytokinesis, and forms two distinct new cells. So basically, during cell division, genetic information that's been copied from the DNA gets separated into two separate cells. So now the two cells have exact copies of the DNA in those chromosomes to then have instructions for that cell to function fully. And then homeostasis. So we have the rusty-patched bumblebee using antenna, taking in information about the flower, and then responding to go find that flower. But you might wonder, what homeostasis are we talking about? Well, in this case, we're actually talking about water balance and thirst. I learned in studying about the rusty-patched bumblebee that they don't seek out water specifically. They actually regulate their water balance by getting flower nectar. And so they're going to be using their antenna to seek out flower nectar, the smell, and then go find it. The key organs involved and systems, well, they're going to use their nervous system to detect, the muscular system to respond to get them to there, the skeletal muscles, or the skeletal system interacts with the skeletal muscles to get the bee to fly and to land and then to use its mouth parts and then begin digesting that nectar and then taking out the water. So peripheral nerves will be involved, taking that information to the brain, and then the brain is going to send out message to respond, interacting with the antenna, the wings, the flight muscles, the legs, the mouth, the tongue. And so these are the different parts of the bee that will be involved. And I didn't finish my adaptation example because that's extra credit, and I want you to figure that out for yourself. Don't forget to include a list of your reference links.